The time is late 1994, and in the video gaming world we're still very much all about that big old 16-bit console war that people have gone through so many times. We know the deal already. SNES has caught up to and is now excelling the Genesis in North America, both are strong in Europe, but the Mega Drive has a lead, and Japan is a Nintendo country. No matter what side you're on though, it was a glorious time. 1994 is commonly regarded as one of the best years in the history of gaming, a year that saw some of the best titles ever released on both the main systems. You'll be seeing some of them here, and they could fill up a Hall of Fame all by their lonesome. It was just a freaking wonderful year. However, it was also the last full year of this generation. As we got into the second half of 1994, the race to kick off the next generation was in full swing. It was assumed, naturally, that Sega and Nintendo would be at the top once again. Indeed, Sega were planning to be the first out of the blocks, doing as they did in the previous generation and getting an early advantage over their blood rivals. But a new competitor would also be joining the fray, in the shape of Sony and their PlayStation. They may be totally new to the world of consoles, but it would be kind of interesting to see how they shaped up. They certainly seemed more serious about it than, Atari or whoever. But still, Sega had established themselves as the one true rival to Nintendo's previous dominance in the eyes of many. Obviously these Sony folks just wanted a new system for their awful movie-based games, didn't they? 1995 was set to be an interesting year, and in this video, we'll look at just what happened in those 12 months that caused Sega to absolutely shit the bed, to lose all the momentum that they had and then some, and to set the wheels of their downfall in motion. A long and graphic fall from Nintendo's great rival to being a zombified shell of what they once were. Actually, if you merely start in January of 95, you won't get the full story at all. By New Year's Day, the war for the 5th generation was well underway. The development of Sega's 32-bit console, the Saturn, began in 1992. Unlike a lot of machines, the Saturn was its name from beginning to end, starting out as the project's code word but ultimately being chosen as its official name. It aimed to innovate and lead the way in 3D graphics with a somewhat unique dual processor system that hadn't really been seen in consoles before, plus video processing that would still be able to create smashing stuff in 2D. By the time 1993 was finished, development on the system was mostly done, but information about the development of Sony's PlayStation caused Sega to make various tweaks here and there, including the enhanced 2D stuff. So, wait, 1993? Geez, we're getting further and further out. But you kind of have to. Sega were trying to work as fast as they could in order to get to the new generation going as quickly as possible. Why so? Well, it's about more than simply beating Sony to the punch. Sega was still working on a tried and tested marketing philosophy. To Sega, the big selling point of a console is its ability to bring arcade experiences home, and they wanted their arcade games in particular to be flawless on the new machine. In the early days of the Mega Drive, that was basically their marketing slogan. Sega by this point had been technically at the forefront of the arcade since around about 1985, and in 1992 they had released the Model 1 board, designed for 3D polygons and the board behind arcade hits such as Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter. The Mega Drive wasn't exactly capable of reproducing games like this. Virtua Racing was eventually released on the system, but only with the help of the SVP chip, their answer to Nintendo's Super FX chip that gave the system the ability to recreate a game like Virtua Racing. However, the cost of this chip drove the manufacturing costs of the cartridge through the roof, not to mention the size of the thing. Virtua Racing was sold in stores for $100, making it the most expensive Mega Drive game and also considerably more expensive than the SNES's banner title for the Super FX, Star Fox. It was a fine experiment, but a better solution was required, and in the end Virtua Racing would be the only game that used the SVP chip. Other arcade smashers like Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA were planned for the SVP, but were eventually, and probably wisely, held over for the future. The solution was a two-pronged 32-bit attack. Alongside the Saturn, Sega would develop the 32X, a cheaper entry into the 32-bit market that would be an add-on to the Mega Drive. It would sell at half the cost of a Saturn, but would boost the power of your Mega Drive no end, further bringing the arcade experience home. Yeah, kind of weak. Some saw it more like an interim piece of kit to hold people over, some as a budget option. The 32X was really freaking confused, but just keep that big old philosophy in mind. People have questioned why the Mega Drive had so many add-ons, what with this and the Sega CD and whatnot, and that was why. For Sega, the arcade experience was the top priority, and as one of the leaders in the arcade, speedy development of their home systems was a necessity. Having a Japanese CEO who came up from the arcade division probably helped here too. Meanwhile, Nintendo had gradually left the arcades behind in the 16-bit generation, but Sony were initially appearing to share Sega's philosophy and were making their own waves. Games like Namco's original Tekken were challenging Sega's technical superiority, and they were already confirmed to be titles for the PlayStation and PlayStation alone. All of this brouhaha created a little bit of internal friction between East and West, that is, Sega of Japan and Sega of America. Prior to this, Sega of America's CEO Tom Kalinske had occasionally ruffled Japanese feathers with his insistence on aggressive marketing, lower prices, and intense focus on Sega's banner title Sonic the Hedgehog, who the Japanese hadn't really ever seen it for. But crucially, he'd always had the support of Sega of Japan's CEO Hayao Nakayama, who simply told him that he'd hired him to make decisions for Europe and the Americas, so go ahead and do it. And so Kalinske was left to his own devices, and honestly he'd been quite successful, what with turning Sega's market share from a virtual lemonade stand into nearly half and what have you. But now there was just that little bit of discontent. Kalinske and Sega of America weren't particularly happy with the design of the Saturn, feeling that it was going to be difficult to create games for and that it was too much too soon. Conversely, they were quite happy with the largely American-made 32X, feeling that the Mega Drive wasn't all the way done yet, and that the 32X would be key to keeping the system going for a good couple of years. By the second half of 1994, Sega of Japan were all about the Saturn, and once it had launched, they would be ready to pretty much drop the Mega Drive out of orbit, taking everything else with it. Yes, including the 32X, which wasn't even out there yet. Japan's focus being so on the Saturn meant that the 32X was very much secondary in their eyes, increasing the tension. Theoretically, it seems kind of sound. The Saturn and 32X getting together, a double hit that would theoretically allow Sega to corner both the premium and budget 32-bit options in the next generation, driving out both the PlayStation and another fierce competitor. The Atari Jaguar, apparently. It was kind of bollocks, but whatever. It did kind of work like this in Japan, with the Saturn launching on November 22nd and the 32X launching on December 3rd. Both launched with the same game, Virtua Fighter. The Saturn port is virtually indistinguishable from the arcade machine, and the 32X port in all honesty isn't all that far behind. The launch date was very important. The Saturn was released just 11 days before Sony's launch of the PlayStation in Japan on December the 3rd, with an initial shipment of 200,000 units selling out on the first day. The second shipment would be released on the same day as the PlayStation, as well as the 32X, which kind of emphasises what Japan truly thought of the add-on, especially seeing as Nakayama's next move after that was to basically discontinue the Mega Drive in Japan. Sorry folks. But the 32X didn't just launch in Japan in 1994, it launched everywhere else too, hitting American shelves on November the 21st, in primo position to be a top seller during the holiday season. Initially, things looked good. Sega's marketing and shipping strategy gave it a crucial head start over Sony, and the Saturn was, at first, proving to be more popular. In America, interest for the 32X was pretty high throughout the holidays, and sales were pretty good. And so, with the wheels turning quite nicely, we headed into 1995. And almost immediately, things start to get shaky. After the holidays, the 32X lost any momentum it had in the West like that, and would go down in price pretty sharpish. What happened? Well, on the consumer side, people knew that the Saturn was already out in Japan, and Sega were making plenty of noise about getting the machine out in the West as soon as possible. People weren't particularly interested in a budget add-on for their Mega Drive, preferring to wait for the new machine. From the developers' side, well, where was the longevity? What was the point of developing something from scratch for something that could well be discontinued by the end of the year? It's no real surprise that Sega's initial trio of launch games, Virtua Fighter, Star Wars Arcade and a close-to-arcade perfect Space Harrier, were close to the only titles of worth on the add-on. A lot of the rest were either souped-up versions of titles already available on the Mega Drive, or titles that were going to be developed for the Mega Drive or Sega CD but were then switched to the 32X, or just, well, piles of utter cack. It should also be noted that while Virtua Fighter was an arcade behemoth in Japan, it wasn't quite as rapturously received in the West. Still regarded as very good indeed, which it was, but not exactly wiping the floor with Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo or even Mortal Kombat 2. This lessened the impact of the game as a launch title, whereas for example the Saturn pretty much launched with Virtua Fighter alone in Japan and didn't need anything else in order to have a good launch. The 32X wasn't a completely terrible idea, but the execution was a total botch up. If anything, it should have launched at least 9 months or so earlier than it actually did. By the time it came out, it was way too late for it to gain any momentum. In essence, it was swallowed up by Sega's own hype for their next-gen console. Following on from the Saturn's initial dash out of the gates in Japan, it couldn't quite keep up that phenomenal pace. The machine was actually doing well and would continue to do so, selling 1 million in its first 6 months, but the PlayStation was quickly gaining ground and by the end of the year it would overtake the Saturn. Sony had enticed a considerable amount of third-party publishers to the machine, way more than Sega, and on top of everything else were way more prepared to utilise the CD format in order to get games out fast. Publishers could order more supplies of the game, Sony could provide those in-house, and they would have them in a little over a week. It was also clear pretty quickly that the PlayStation was better at 3D than the Saturn. Its triangular polygons were apparently much more welcome than Saturn's quadrilateral ones. On the other hand, Sega had created an absolutely amazing 2D machine, and Japan never stopped being fans of 2D stuff. Basically, the Saturn wasn't doing too badly in Japan at all. Virtua Fighter was soon joined by the likes of Panzer Dragoon, as well as plenty of the requisite RPGs that are pretty much required for a console to be a success over there, and sales were consistent. It was clear that CDs were blossoming, and even at this early stage Nintendo's decision to stick with cartridges for the Ultra 64, which had only really been seen in pictures so far, was looking like a mistake. Still, the West was important. Why, the West was basically Sega's stronghold, the place where they'd had way more success than they'd previously had in Japan. Europe and the US were the core markets, and having rejected the 32X, a load of, well, fairly irked video game nerds were desperate for news about the Saturn. Tom Kalinske would give them something that would hopefully satisfy them. September 2nd, 1995, or Saturn Day, the proposed launch date of the new machine, a week before the US launch of the PlayStation on September 9th, Sega were looking to basically repeat the same trick they'd used to good effect in Japan. A good strategy, perhaps. If only they'd, went through with it. To be honest, the disaster of Sega's 1995, at least in public, comes down to one day in particular, May the 11th. Something very special was happening on that day. This was the day of the first ever Electronic Entertainment Expo in Los Angeles. The world of gaming as a whole had previously been frustrated at the limited space offered to limit electronics trade fairs like CES in the past, and the founding of IDSA, the International Digital Software Association, in 1994, quickly led to the creation of a trade fair specifically for the video game industry, the annual event that would soon simply become known as E3. The game industry now had a roof over their heads. Of course, E3 in 1995 was a totally different beast to what it is now. No one was necessarily waiting on tenterhooks to see what games would be announced, nobody was going to be streaming a bunch of corporate keynotes to millions of people, and if an executive had shown up with a tattoo marking the announcement of a brand new game, they'd have probably been dragged off the stage. It was a relatively staid affair, more political party conference than big sexy electronic nirvana. Still, what was of interest to everyone was details on the new next-gen machines that were to be released imminently. Launch titles, funky 90s adverts, marketing and all that, and oh yeah, that most certainly was going to happen. Nintendo's Howard Lincoln was the first to go. Now you'll notice that we've barely mentioned Nintendo up to this point. At this point they were keeping almost totally stum, unlike Sega and Sony. Nintendo had a longer game in mind, and they weren't getting involved in the fight. They released specifications for the machine that was then still known as the Ultra 64, but there was no footage of it in action. Up next was Sega of America's CEO, Tom Kalinske. The highlight of Kalinske's presentation is plenty of footage of the Saturn in action, a near 10-minute press video of all the games for the system, everything you could get at launch, with all the mid-90s production you can stomach. There's Virtua Fighter, naturally, Daytona, Panzer Dragoon, Clockwork Knight, and the video ends with an odd sci-fi woman saying, "It's out there. It's out there." And indeed it was. Following this, Kalinske dropped the bombshell. The Sega Saturn was out on the shelves already at the cost of $399. The next generation had arrived, and now everybody can scarp to try and buy one. Sega had decided to move Saturn Day, just a tat, shocking everybody in attendance. You certainly couldn't accuse his presentation of being uneventful. And finally, Sony took the stage with their CEO, Olaf Olafsson. So the story goes, Olafsson went up and for around about 15 minutes intentionally bored the audience stiff with a bunch of drivel about projections for the future and what have you, lots of graphs and bar charts, seriously hardcore gonzo business stuff. Just at the point where everyone was settling in for a bit of a snooze, he invited Sony of America's CEO Steve Race up to say a few words. Actually, he said one word. $2.99.
$2.99.
The audience erupted into cheers. If there was going to be a price war, then it was already pretty much over before it had begun. According to the book Console Wars, Kalinske had 2 words to say to the executive next to him in response to that. Oh shit. So it goes and what have you. May the 11th 1995 is a famous day, and that is a very famous story that you'll see told again and again. Fairly soon from now you'll see it told on the big screen even. Sega's decision to launch the Saturn early would go down as one of the most haphazard, ill thought out, and quite frankly idiotic decisions in the entire history of gaming, especially as it came with the doubly bad decision to discontinue the Mega Drive in Europe and North America in order to concentrate everything on the Saturn. How come though? Surely it was a good thing to be first in such a way? To blast the audience with shock and awe? Well, let's break it down. Firstly, Sega were only launching with 30,000 Saturns, enough to sell out pretty quick, the aim of the campaign being almost proto-viral marketing, but it would mean that they would select their retailers who would get it. The selected retailers who got Saturns to sell were okay enough with that, but it pissed off everyone else, including Best Buy and Walmart. One retailer, KB Toys, even dropped Sega completely because of what they'd done and because of how furious they were at not being amongst Sega's selected retailers, which included the likes of Toys R Us, Electronics Boutique and Babbage's. The viral marketing campaign just didn't take really, especially in these days when the internet was only just starting to boom. It wasn't exactly expected and perhaps confused people a little. Suddenly Saturns are literally dumped onto the shelves and everyone's like, wait, it's out? With virtually no info or anything. But hey, pay $399 to find out more. Things don't work this way. It's hard to see how Sega could have ever feasibly achieved more doing that than they would have done with sticking to the original plan and launching with quite a few more Saturns in stock. Surely to God that was the better idea. People who didn't get them at first were then annoyed at the wait for new shipments to arrive. Sega were about as prepared for their own launch as everyone else was, it seemed. The launch titles also weren't necessarily big sellers. Games like Panzer Dragoon and Clockwork Knight were certainly worthy, but were also totally unknown quantities, and there was also Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA. Good games, great games even, but again, not as popular as the West as they were in Japan, and plus they weren't exactly able to be marketed because of the Saturn's launch. Both games also had serious and in some ways more impressive direct competition, Tekken and Ridge Racer, and both of those would be on the PlayStation. Hell, Ridge Racer was going to be a launch title and Tekken was not far behind. Speaking of titles, the early release was a shock to third-party developers who were making plenty of games for the Saturn, but they were making them with the original Saturn Day release date in mind and were just as shocked about the early release as everyone else. Only 2 new games for the Saturn were released between the shock arrival on May 11th and its originally proposed launch date of September the 9th. And where was that spiky blue hedgehog? He seemed to have been forgotten in the midst of everything, and he was the entire face of Sega in the West. A lot of people weren't even going to bother with Saturn until they had info on the new Sonic game that was obviously going to be released on it. Wasn't it? But the worst thing of all, perhaps, was how much time it gave the PlayStation. Sega's hideous move literally did the exact opposite of what was intended of it. It was a bullying, aggressive move, made so that Sony would surely have to rush their own console out in order to meet them in the shops in America face to face. Except they didn't, they stuck to their guns. The Saturn was already out after all. They'd purposely foregone almost any pre-release ad campaign in favour of just sticking it on the shelves, therefore Sony were able to run their massive, multi-million-dollar ad campaign for the PlayStation virtually unopposed. They broke the Saturn down, noted all of its faults, and hit the system where it hurt. They learnt from all the mistakes Sega made, whether it was in the launch themselves or how they were advertising the console. Sony made the in retrospect fantastic move to gear their console towards the 18 to 25 market, making the Saturn look like old hat already by comparison. It works almost like a 15 or 18 rated action movie. It's marketed to older people, but it's so bombastic that all the younger people will want to see it too. And there's no age restriction on a PlayStation. They noted that their arcade conversions were much more perfect than those of Sega's, which, shock of horrors, they were. Namco, makers of Tekken and Ridge Racer, were currently using a System 11 board. Less impressive than Sega's Model 2, but it's essentially a PlayStation inside an arcade cabinet, enabling the ports of both games to be virtually flawless. No matter what the Saturn's dual processing was like, it didn't have a Model 2 inside of it, and apparently it was indeed a pain in the arse to make 3D games for. Oh, and had anyone mentioned that the PS1 was $100 cheaper? I'm sure Sony probably did. Sega's moves, and their add-ons, the total failure of their double-pronged attack, caused many people to lose trust in them, and they flocked en masse to the new kid on the block. Simply put, Sega's near 4-month head start over the PlayStation enabled them to sell 180,000 units. When the PlayStation was released, it sold 100,000 units in 2 days, and would eclipse that number well inside of the first month, generating a massive lead by the holiday season that the Saturn would never come close to competing with. 1995 continued, with many quality games released for the Saturn, versions of successful arcade games like Virtua Fighter 2 and Sega Rally Championship and the like. But the PlayStation would win through sheer saturation. Right from the off, it had a much larger library than Sega, again a lot of this going back to that premature launch. It had the marketing and it had everything. They'd outmaneuvered Sega at every turn. It was a landslide victory. Beyond the holiday season in 1995, the interest in the Saturn fell through the floor. And alas, the exact same story played out in Europe, the place where Sega had actually beaten Nintendo. Once again, the Saturn launched too early, the PlayStation had a much bigger marketing budget, 20 million as opposed to 4 million, and those people who'd stuck with the Mega Drive in the past generation were now flocking to PlayStation. Just like that, Sega had lost this console war. More than that, they were crushed. By the end of 1995, they had undone just about everything they had achieved over 5 long years. It was that quick. So the question is, why? And who was responsible? Who was to blame for making one of the worst decisions in the history of video games? The story goes that the decision came from Japan. Depending on who you read, they either mandated that the Saturn be released in May, or forced Kalinsky to release it in May at gunpoint. Either way, this part of the story is pretty much confirmed. But the question of why still remains. In an interview with Sega 16, Tom Kalinsky wonders if there was perhaps a little resentment on the Japanese side of the Mega Drive's success in the West. The console had not done all that well in Japan, meaning that Sega of America pretty much had the reins of the company. After Hayao Nakayama had given Kalinsky his blessing in 1991, he had run Sega of America without any interference from Japan for 4 years. Even potential flashpoints such as a frustrated Yuji Naka, head of Sonic Team, defecting from Sega of Japan to America's Sega Technical Institute in order to make Sonic 2, had not noticeably affected Kalinsky's position. But Nakayama was still the CEO at the time of the Saturn, and perhaps he saw this as a chance to reassume control and to concentrate more on making Sega successful in its home country. We do not know Nakayama's side of the story, of course. He does not give interviews, and nor has any other member of Japan's board of directors at the time. Kalinsky's side is obviously more well known. A lot of it is taken from a popular book, Blake J. Harris's Console Wars, that takes place almost entirely from his point of view, which will soon be made into a documentary and a feature film. The disharmony between the success of Sega in the East and West hardly helped. In fairness, Nakayama's decision to virtually discontinue the Mega Drive in Japan in favour of the Saturn in late 1994 was undoubtedly the correct one. The Mega Drive was completely outgunned by Nintendo, and the time was ripe for the Saturn to come out over there. However, his decision to extend that to North America and Europe in early 1995 was clearly not. The SNES still sold well in 1995 and 1996, proving that even though the 32-bit era had come, the 16-bit era was not fully finished yet, and the Mega Drive could have easily been a part of that. It should also be noted, mind you, that the failed 32X was largely a project designed by Sega of America, and that's hardly a point in their favour. The unfortunate part of all of this, really, is that both Japan and America were at loggerheads. For both sides, Japan in particular, it was a case of all or nothing. something had to give, and ultimately Sega in Japan reassumed near total control of their own company. By now we know how everything played out. The Sony PlayStation became the dominant console in the West by far. It virtually wiped out the Saturn. No matter what titles the system had, they weren't ever going to be enough to reverse the momentum. For any memorable and successful game that the Saturn could release, the PlayStation had about 3. The price of the Saturn fell from $399 to $199 inside of a year, meaning that Sega were barely making a profit on it in the West. A true Sonic game never ended up arriving for the machine, although honestly it's doubtful whether even the Blue Bullet would have made all that much of a difference. And no, Sonic R doesn't count. Nintendo finally entered the next generation in the West on September 26, 1996 with the newly rechristened Nintendo 64 at a competitive $199 price point, but with a mere 2 games. However, crucially one of those was Super Mario 64. It pays somewhat to have your biggest product available right from the off, doesn't it? The N64 had massive momentum that allowed it to briefly outsell Sony for a time, but the usage of cartridges slowed the release of games, and it wasn't too long before the PlayStation, still riding the wave, regained the lead. However, the Nintendo 64 would occupy the number 2 position comfortably. The Saturn was a distant, barely even acknowledged third. In the East, things were a little rosier. The Saturn had remained a consistent seller and was a comfortable number 2 behind the PlayStation. Yes, number 2. The N64 in Japan had not been a particularly big success for Nintendo, mainly thanks to the fact that it had barely any RPGs on it, especially after names like Squaresoft and Enix had switched to Sony. No Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy on Nintendo? No sale. Both the Saturn and PlayStation could provide plenty of RPGs, including those two of course, and so they were the 2 top consoles of the generation in Japan. The Saturn would have a decent life in Japan. It lasted until 2000 there, and would go on to become Sega's most successful console in that region. Cause hell, no one's coming here to bury the machine. It was a fine console indeed, and the more conventional launch in Japan had helped it go quite a way. Sega had finally achieved one goal at least, the goal of beating Nintendo in Japan. However, they had achieved this at the expense of just about everything else they'd had in every part of the world. Tom Kalinske, never exactly the biggest fan of the Saturn, resigned from his position as Sega of America's CEO in April of 1996, and he would be replaced as the company's figurehead by Executive Vice President Bernie Stolar, who had masterminded the PlayStation's launch. Under Stolar, however, the Saturn would continue to flounder. Stolar also had this brilliant philosophy of 1. No 2D games, and 2. No RPGs, which obviously jived really well with the Saturn's strong points and brilliant 2D development. The floundering continued, with a final flourish of a ton of just plain cancelled titles in 1998, before the system was quite suddenly discontinued in early 99, well before the 5th generation was over. Even here, right at the end, this move annoyed major third-party publishers like Electronic Arts, who'd ended up making a loss on games developed for the Saturn, and they announced that they would no longer work with Sega, ending a 10-year partnership and landing a big blow on the prospects for Sega's next machine, the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast, while celebrated, would never sell enough to heal up the damage that had already been done to Sega's reputation and holdings in the West. It wasn't able to gain ground over the already existing PS1 and N64, it wasn't ever able to attract enough third-party interest, and when the PS2 arrived in late 2000, things frankly looked epically, almost miserably bleak. When the Dreamcast itself was discontinued on March 31st, 2001, Sega announced that they were leaving the console business altogether and restructuring themselves as a third-party publisher. The transition from the bold and brash Sega of old into the zombified shell of its former self that we know today was complete. Another part of all of this, perhaps sadly in some ways, was the downfall of Sega's main philosophy, that of bringing the arcade experience home. The arcade experience was important at the launch of both the Saturn and the PlayStation, but the arcade games that were PlayStation bound were largely running off PlayStation hardware already. Over the course of the 5th generation, all 3 main machines were creating original games that were just as impressive, if not way more so, than anything released in the arcades. Undaunted by this, Sega based the Dreamcast off of their latest arcade board, the Naomi, allowing the system to have flawless ports of the likes of Crazy Taxi and House of the Dead 2. But such things simply weren't going to sell the system anymore. Despite the brilliant hardware they had, Sega's approach was sadly looking outdated. The home systems had caught up with the arcades, pushing the arcades towards irrelevance. Just another little factor in this whole period that changed the way gaming looked forever, but in the end sadly led to the incredibly ugly downfall of a once beloved company. Even as someone who, like many, abandoned Sega for Sony, it was a shame, perhaps even more so because it really could have been avoided if it wasn't for that damn old pesky thing called pride. Bye for now.